afternoon, everyone. My name is Vandana. A very warm welcome to InspireOne's webinar on Performance Accelerator. Now, let me begin by introducing our facilitator, Mrs. Neeta Mohla. She's the director at InspireOne and head of leadership practice. She has 3 decades of experience, which is an interesting mix of corporate and consulting work. She is an expert in the area of emotional intelligence and has authored a book called Human Drama. Over to you, Neeta.
Thank you very much, Vandana. And at the outstart, I would like to just introduce our organization, InspireOne. InspireOne is a consulting company working in the space of people development. We have been in operations for over 16 years, and it is our focus to provide sustainable long-term solutions for our clients, which are measurable in their outcomes. We operate through 3 of our global partners. The first one being IBM. We are a business partner for IBM in India and in this region. And through IBM, we provide solutions around employee assessments, engagements, and leadership solutions. We also represent TAC and TMI in India. TAC helps us to provide solutions around sales and sales consulting. And through TMI, we provide solutions around performance improvement and enhancement, change, organization change and development, and also service orientation. The agenda for today is largely the following. By the end of this 1 hour, we hope to discuss with you challenges to do with employee development and how is it that organizations globally and otherwise are overcoming these challenges. We will also go through our process, which is the performance acceleration process, and we will look at 3 issues around that. The first is to do with how do we get everybody aligned. The second is creation of a robust IDP which is actionable, and also how do we foster and cascade continuous learning through organizations. Finally, we will talk about some of our client case studies to pick on certain examples, and we will leave it open for questions and answers. I would like to start with a quote from the famous management consultant, Noel Tichy. What he says is the following: winning companies win because they have good leaders who nurture the development of all other leaders at all levels of the organization. This is a fact. And in fact, what we have also seen is that organizations that have created leaders and have really developed people are those which have mandated their leaders to spend up to almost 30% of their time and their KRA on managing people. So this is something we can't get away with. However, when we look at challenges with respect to people development, I would also like to first quote from one of the IBM study, which says that 71% of CEOs cite human capital out of everything else as the #1 source of sustained economic value. And mind you, this is ahead of products, ahead of customer relationships and brands. So 71% of CEOs believe that human capital is what is going to help them create sustained economic value. When we come to the CHROs, this is also a global study done by our partner IBM. You can see that actually the CHROs believe that they are not very equipped to handle this challenge. So whether it is rapid development of workforce skills, they believe they're only 28% ready. Whether it is talent management, workforce productivity, talent development, and even performance management evaluation. These are areas that they are struggling with, and they don't have ready-made solutions of how this can be handled. So in conclusion, it's of course the management consultants who say this is very critical. It is the CEOs who believe this is a burning issue for them. And it is also the CHROs who agree that this is an area they've not been able to handle very well. So we'll dig deeper a little bit into these challenges. And here we are looking at the challenges with respect to development processes and see what really happens when we look at people development. Starting with executives at the top, They realize the importance of people development, so it's not a question of making them aware. They realize, understand, and accept it, but they have not figured out how to make learning operational for their workforce. So even if there are gaps, how do we make the learning for these gaps operational is something that they are finding difficult to do. There are definitely considered lack of skills and knowledge amongst the managers in various areas. So whether this is to do with giving effective feedback, coaching people for the development gaps, understanding what competencies mean in their roles and how these can be used to develop people, and as well as how do we create strong IDPs. Skill gaps are across all these areas. It perhaps is because of this and other reasons as well. There is not enough ownership among managers and individuals. Now, this is surprising. Individuals want this, but there's not enough ownership to make employee development initiatives a success. And then there is disproportionate focus from organizations on the 10% of development, which means the formal training and education is something that they're looking at effectively and spending a lot of time on, but this is only going to give 10% of results. So the rest 90% is what they don't know what to do about. And this is leading to situations where client says our people are overtrained but underdeveloped. Now, the 90% is where people really need to spend time, which is really looking at systems which help people to adopt to their learning or make mistakes and also be able to relearn. Some of the other challenges, and I'll go through this a little fast, is to do with change. And of course, the accelerated pace of change is needing people to constantly learn and relearn. And this is not very easy because by the time you come to the gap, you come to the plan, things have changed on the ground. The next point is a very interesting point that we see in organizations that have large employee forces and also that have been in existence for a long time. So there is this big layer of unutilized capital. These are people who have reached possibly the terminal roles, but because of rapid change, they also need to be retrained to be able to adopt to the new competencies and skills. So this is a big issue for organizations. There is a lack of consistency in the development approaches, with respect to all the functions that exist in an organization. And finally, when we look at engagement, this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And while this is an issue, the opportunity for people to provide learning to manage employee engagement is not coming together very effectively. So these are some of the challenges that we obviously through our own research, our own work with organizations, and also some global research, we've been able to unearth. Talking about challenges, let's also look at how companies and organizations are working to overcome these. This is no surprise that organizations are re-engineering their performance management process. Here I just want to spend a minute, and possibly a lot of you are already aware that many organizations have now worked towards doing away with the standard bell curve assessment and rating them on and performance ranking. Now, this has happened in almost 70 organizations worldwide, but the reasons why organizations have done away with this ranking system is not because they were finding ranking difficult to do, but what they were finding is that the entire performance appraisal process in the system was not delivering the result that it is supposed to, which means it is not giving us the output that people are then ready to be able to perform their roles. So something is not going right, and of course what they looked at is the assessment part of it, which is really a critical part of the process, is important, but ranking is not helping people to just, build their skills. So the idea is how can we move the performance management system and process towards making it more development focused rather than just simply assessment focused. These are 10 areas where Burson has come up with this report talking about the trends going forward. So these are 10 areas which are going to be very critical for organizations to focus on with respect to the performance management process. But since in this particular webinar, we are only talking about the development end of the performance management process, possibly we'll focus on the 3 that are marked in a circle. Moving on, this is an interesting slide because this talks about the fact that whichever end you want to start with. So there are organizations that say that we have assessments in place, and now we want to ensure that from assessments, how do we ensure that our people are developing themselves, and we have the 70-20-10 right. There are organizations that say we want to do it right across. We want the assessment, we want the IDPs, we want to ensure that there is also development. And sometimes there are organizations who say that we want only particular skilling. But ideally, for an organization to embark on a process which ensures that development processes are working well for organizations, they have to look through the lens of change management. So here what we're talking about is basically cascading and communicating, which is absolutely critical once you've created a business case. What we're also saying is that it is very, very critical that obviously a single person or a single department, let's say an L&D, OD, or an HR department alone can't make this work. It has to make business sense and it has to have business collaboration. What we are also saying is organizations can easily add up to 20% to their bottom line if they focus on developing their human capital. And of course, what we are saying is that this needs to be whatever process, whatever skilling that is done needs to be sustained and hence has to become part of an organization culture. With this, I would like to actually focus upon our acceleration process. And I would also like to state here that we've taken this process from the part where we are assuming that performance feedback has been given, the gaps have been identified, and the gaps have been understood by the person. So taking from there, not to say that that's not important, we also focus on that part, but what we're really looking at is the part after that. So what happens when the assessment is done or a performance feedback is given, but what happens after that and what are some of the steps that can be taken to ensure that this process works well. I would like to focus here that like I mentioned earlier, the 10% is what organizations have got right. They know how to do it and they're focusing on it. But it is the 70 and 20% which becomes absolutely important. So the alignment with respect to the 70 and 20%, because you cannot do the 70 and 20% without alignment, becomes very, very critical. What we are also talking about is that when we come to creation of robust IDPs, in general, what we have found in our experience with organizations is that IDPs are very vague. They're not actionable, and quite often they are mixed with what a KRA is. So hence, if we need to get the learning right, we have to ensure that learning goals are well created at the start and leading on to creating strong and robust IDPs. Also, when we come to continuous learning, what we are finding is more and more, and this is a trend going forward, the onus is going to come back on the manager. So if the manager's discretion is going to become very critical, the manager needs to be continuously trained on how to give feedback, on how to coach, on how to ensure that these IDPs are well created, and also to have a substantial understanding of what learning goals are all about. So this is how we create alignment, and as you can see, this is alignment through a process. So there is a time that you create alignment with the stakeholders, but the ideal situation is that they are being aligned right through all the steps of the process. An alignment with business will only happen when whatever we are doing is aligned to the business goal, and hence the step number one is to do with that. So can we first understand what is the critical business strategy? So let's say what is the strategy for the next 3 years? And in order for the organization to meet those strategic goals, what are the critical competencies that the organization needs to focus on organization-wide? So that's step number one. And now you probably have the ears and the eyes of the top management team, because what you're talking to them is that to meet your business strategy, what are the competencies that are absolutely critical? And then, of course, this is what is going to be taken down. Step number two is the step where we say, let's start with identifying critical roles that really will make the business strategy happen. And then identify for these critical roles, what are these competencies? So once again, we have the organization-wide competencies. We then have critical roles, which are very, very important, which will really deliver these business objectives. And for these critical roles, what are these competencies? What is the ranking? What is the prioritization that we need to do with respect to these competencies? What we've also done very successfully, and we'll share case studies later, is that we've helped organizations create IDP guides. And what IDP guides essentially do is, through processes of interviewing, help to bring out. So let's say there is a competency required for a role. What does good look like? What does the person have to do very specifically by way of this competency in order for that person to perform at a high level? So through best practices, we bring these competencies live, and also the conversations that we have with, let's say, the role holder, the immediate manager, and the skip level leader is really to say what projects, so what should the person do, what projects should the person be engaged in so as to be able to build this relevant competency. We'll show you a glimpse of this, a part of it. Obviously, this is extremely a bulky document that is created, but just to give you an idea, we'll take you through an example. It is then that we enable organizations and actually individuals to create meaningful IDPs following the 70-20-10 principle. So through the guides, people are able to clearly say, this is my gap, and hence I understand what that gap really means. And I'm able to also then document in the IDP template, what project can I take? What critical area can I be assigned, which will help me to grow this particular competency? What can I do by way of 20%? What opportunities are there in the organization? And of course, the 10%. Now, this is at the start done by us usually, but in large organizations, what we recommend is that this is a skill that we transfer into the organization. So while we may create some guides, what we are actually doing is, alongside training a group of people in the organization, let's call them champions. So we are really training them to create these guides for the rest of the roles. We're also training them on understanding what is a skill in terms of being able to, through conversations, align the person to their development goal, help them to understand, take ownership, and create strong IDPs. So the cascade process, which is step number 4, is really then enabling the organizations and the champions. We give them collaterals, we give them aids, and we enable them to cascade this process throughout the organization in a phased way. And finally, step number 5, and of course this is not in a linear way. You may start with step number 5 to a small group and then go whichever way. Step number 5 is really all about ensuring that there are skills transferred to everyone within the organization, so that there's ownership at all levels. There is the skill to know what is it that needs to be done, and then there is commitment. So this is our 5-step process of performance acceleration. And of course, alignment, as we said, is through the process. I'm now going to take you through a specific example just to give you a high-level understanding of what really happens. So let's say we first unearth the business strategy, and basically it's not unearthing the business strategy, but unearthing the critical competencies that are needed to meet the strategic objectives. Of course, this is done through a lot of interviewing, through a lot of fact finding, etc. So basically understanding the critical competencies that are relevant to an organization to meet its strategic goals, let's say for a period of the next 3 years. Now, what we've done here is we've taken an example of DGM sales, assuming that this is a mid-management level, and a lot of issues of actually delivering the strategy really come about in this particular role. The mid-management being very critical to the strategy being implemented on the ground. So what we've done here, what we are demonstrating here is, through interviews with the relevant stakeholders, we've found out what are the critical competencies and at what proficiency levels are these required for the DGM sales role. And this is just a small snapshot of it, obviously not a complete document. Once we've got this, now what we are saying is that, so we are taking now one example of customer focus. We are saying that customer focus is required at a proficiency level 3 for this particular role. And usually organizations have a competency descriptor which describes this competency at this proficiency level. So here it is basically identifies and responds to current and future customer needs. Now here's where individuals and organizations face an issue. So while this is a very generic description, a DGM sales is unable to understand what should he do because he believes he's already doing this. And of course, because it's part of his role, he is doing it to an extent. So what we do through the IDP guides is to identify what is something that is really required for the role and what is something with respect to this particular competency that high performers do differently. So an example of this is a DGM engages periodically, which is once a week. So that is stated a little clearly with key customers to understand any changes in demands, needs, gathers data through various sources and revises the sales strategy for the region from time to time based on this information. Now, this is just a small expansion of this, but we may give an illustration of how this really works on the ground. So, for example, a DGM in this case would need to know not only his customers' requirements, but where the customer is in his phase of business, what are some of the challenges that the customer is facing with respect to his customers, what are some of the additional let's say environmental issues that the person needs to know which will help this particular customer in being able to make decisions and help him to be able to sell his product, etc., etc. So we will then bring this competency to life by giving real case studies. And I think once this is done, for a DGM to understand what exactly is required by him within this competency becomes very clear. So therefore, what we do is we define the desired state for each role, and also we create role-specific IDP guides. What is not mentioned here is we transfer this particular skill to the organization because then they can take it down for all the other roles. So this is step number one. We have identified critical competencies, and again here what I'd like to say, the idea is to simplify, because if there are too many competencies it becomes too complex. We want to know the critical few which is going to lead to the maximum result, and the focus is on that. The next part of it is, now having understood this, how do we ensure that there is ownership of the person whose IDP it is, ownership of the manager, because this is a process that they are going to lead from here on, and also that this is really successful. People have the skills to be able to do that. So this is how the ownership in the individual comes about. We have already talked about this. I'm going to summarize this a little bit first. We have the organization needs coming from values, mission, vision, etc. And the desired competencies required, let's say, for the next 3 years. For the individual, we also have the areas of gaps and the areas of strengths. Now, here's another issue. Areas of strength and how to leverage this is often missed out in IDP plans, but this is most important. So we have the individual strengths and the individual areas of development. What we also do is look at individual goals and career aspirations. Now, most organizations do look at this, but they look at it mostly for people who they identify as high potential. So the high pots, typically in organizations, do know that they are high pots, and at least even if they don't know, they know that there is a clear, development plan, and they are aware of it, and they're given opportunities to do that. Now that's great, but I think what happens in all of this is, because they are high pots, they perform well. But are organizations equipped to ensure that the performance is optimal is still a question mark. When we come to people who are not high pots, and in organizations where this is a huge number, it's perhaps not a good idea to leave these guys out, because they also are very, very important, and it's a huge resource that needs to be optimized. So through this process, what we are really trying to do is to ensure that even if we are looking at people who are not high pots, we are trying to identify what is it that is an individual goal and aspiration, and also what is it that in the next 1 to 3 years they need to do differently, because the market is changing and their skills also need to be upgraded. And then basically, once these conversations have happened, then dovetailing this into a 70-20-10 plan. I cannot emphasize the importance of the 70% because, as we all know, the 70-20-10 principle is all about 70% of the learning is happening on the job. So if this is not properly called out, then obviously the whole development opportunity is really lost. Now the next two slides are just giving a snapshot. Incidentally, the slide deck will be shared with you, but the next two slides are just giving a snapshot of some of the aids that we give to equip people to handle the process. So an IDP quality checklist is typically something that is co-created with the client. And in fact, the process is co-created, the aids are co-created to suit the need of the client so that the process is followed well and people have a good way of ensuring that, for example, if we've gone through all these steps, we can be rest assured that the quality is there. And likewise, when we look at the IDPs, we ensure that people have a good idea of what quality really looks like. And of course, here there are some of the common gaps which we find when we review quality of IDPs. But again, this is not a complete sample. It's just giving you some indication. Now, when the quality process is followed and a person's aspiration and the company's performance requirements are met, are merged, then there is a greater chance that the individual is empowered to ensure that this process is working well for him and he's likely or she's likely to put in all their efforts to ensure success of this. What the next step is all about is that once we have ensured that the IDP has gone well, the skills of being able to handle what we call development conversations is transferred to everybody. So of course to all the leaders within the organization, but also to individuals who are part of this process. Now, this is now really taking on from the fact that once these champions are now working on their own, what we are also helping them to do is to plan their implementation and timelines, and then basically equipping them to be able to hold workshops further in the organization to be able to transfer these skills and giving them aids and helping them to define measures of success and a review process. So this is taking on from, let's say, the work that we would have done in the initial part of the process and slowly handing it over to the organization to take it forward for the rest of the employees. Within InspireOne, we have very, very strong programs. Now, these are programs which are, again, customized to organizations. And when I say customized, these are customized to their performance process and, of course, the performance process templates. Time Manager is a time-tested program which is, of course, running globally for the last 60 years. In fact, what I want to say is Microsoft Outlook engages TMI worldwide to run this program for them. So this is really about ensuring that people have the right goals. That's number one. And they are spending their time. You're giving them skills so that they're spending their time on the right goals so as to achieve objectives. Coaching conversations that get results, because all the new research around neuro leadership and all the new research around how we learn is pointing to the fact that coaching conversations are very, very critical in the development process. And how we engage people with understanding their strengths and linking it to their aspirations and, of course, linking it to their organization success becomes a very powerful motivator for a person to want to learn. And Great Performance Conversations is another product that we offer. And this product really talks about how do we ensure people have the right skills to be able to handle performance conversations, give feedback, ensure that development goals are created. And typically, this is then followed by coaching conversations that create results. Organizations, of course, that have developed this competence up to a certain extent can get customized workshops from us to bridge in the gaps which may exist for them specifically. Finally, what I'm going to say is that at InspireOne, we are constantly upgrading our skills, processes, and technology to meet the current needs of organizations and linking it to the current researches that are now available to us. These are some of the things that are coming from the new research. And some of this, of course, is obviously would be known to you that lifespan of a skill is shrinking. So skill has to be very quickly imparted because, again, the skill is going to change its nature given the change in the overall ecosystem. So how do we ensure that the skill is being given quickly and in a you know in a way which is helping a person to perform well? How can we also ensure, now going to the second point, that people are accepting learning more because it is personal to them and not because it's a good thing to do? And how do we constantly sustain it? So, for example, one of the research findings, which is quite, which is quite fascinating, is talking about the fact that earlier it was believed that by repeating a particular a tool or repeating a particular skill, a person learns that best. But today what we are finding is that that's not true. With all the research around neuroscience, what is being found or what is being discovered is learning happens best when there is an insight. And when there is an insight and a certain part of the brain is activated, that's when learning gets really embedded. So we are also gearing up for that through a lot of technology-led solutions as well. And here what we are seeing is what is absolutely critical is that there are unique development plans created for individuals which are unique to that person, unique to that person's skills, unique to that person's strengths, and unique to that person's role. And by way of technology, what we are also offering organizations are a couple of products. One of them is Mastro, which is really looking at it's an app-based application which is looking at ongoing learning in a fun and creative way. And Supernova Leadership, which is actually the IBM Watson's technology. This is in conjunction with IBM Watson's technology, which is looking at giving constant feedback to leaders on the skills and the behaviors that they are implementing on the job. So these are some of the new products, but what I would like to do now is to spend the next 5 minutes talking about the case studies and some of the client success stories that we have been able to create along with the companies that we worked with. The first one was a data analytics company. Now, this company was a new company, newly formed company, which is recently also looked at a performance management system and a process. Now, they realized that while they had a strong PMS in place, what was happening was this was not leading to real development goals being called out, and the process of ensuring that these goals are then understood and are worked upon was a big gap. So where we came in was they had their performance management process and system in place. We understood their system and process, and we further added to that. So we equipped their leaders to first of all have the skill or build the skill to be able to use the process effectively. And especially when we talk about process, it was not just the process, the skill of being able to give performance feedback, the skills of being able to call out the development goals, and the skills of being able to create strong IDPs. Through this process, we identified a group of people who then took to this process very well. So these were people who then we identified as IDP champions. And these IDP champions, we then worked through these champions to ensure that the rest of the organization created quality IDPs. And as a result of this intervention, within a span of, say, about 8 to 9 months, 95% of the people in the organizations had created their IDPs successfully. And when I say successfully, to a reasonably acceptable quality. So that was the scope, and that was a great success that we achieved working with this particular client. The second is a case study where we worked with the client in a fairly long engagement. In fact, it's still ongoing. And with this particular client, so this client was a large organization working in the area of automotives, farm equipment, and multiple businesses. So in this particular organizations, they had their competency frameworks in place, they had their performance management systems in place, and they had a lot of their managers trained on some of these processes also in place. However, what was happening was that both for the people who were high potentials and for people who were in roles who were not going to grow very much more because they had reached their potential, uh, the organization realized that they're not going to be able to grow unless these people start performing at higher levels. So to be able to do that, what we then figured out was the entire process. What was lacking or what was important, both. What was important for the organization, what is it that was lacking by way of critical roles, and what is it that they really needed to do differently. We created IDP guides for about 14 critical roles, and we also worked with the IDP champions who were identified as in the start of this process to help them understand how to conduct these interviews with relevant stakeholders. And one was the interview, the other was how do we get their alignment. So they were really trained on that. And post this, we worked with the champions to create these IDP guides so that they understood the process really well. Once these IDP guides were created, what we did was enable these IDP champions to develop the skills and competence to run this internally, which meant we actually trained them a lot on the processes of holding development conversation, on the skills of being able to create strong IDPs, and then be able to also develop their own train the trainer skills so that they could then take it across in the organization. And of course, we equip them with various aids. And one of the big successes of this currently is that so the timelines that were created for these champions to cascade this through the organizations, they're really working at it very, very successfully, and there is a great buzz in the organization and great excitement around this. So they have also then further linked it to engagement. They have linked it to various other things, which is making the whole process even more robust. We worked with the bank. That's the third case study. Now, this bank had, really focused on people development. So that was one of their imperatives right through the organization. It was a global bank, so the mandate was global. So that was not a real issue for us. They already had that mindset. But again, the problem was that the development plans were not getting created well. And most of these development plans were not getting created well because people did not know how to use these competencies. They understood the competencies, but they didn't know how to dovetail these competencies into the IDPs. So what we helped this organization do was to create these IDP guides, and these guides were not created role-wise, but were created for all the competencies. And this became so successful that this was shared as a best practice in one of the town halls and became a case study for the bank globally. So these are some of the case studies. Obviously, we don't have time to go through this very much more, but I thought that it would be useful for you to understand that how some of these case studies would have enabled these organizations to work on the 70-20-10, especially on the 70%, which is where we find organizations struggle the most. So this has been a fairly long monologue. So what I'm going to do now is to ensure that we also have a little bit of dialogue and discussion. And at this point, we will really welcome a lot of questions. Some of these questions have been coming to us while we've been going through this presentation, but we will encourage you to type some more. And just a reminder, we will be able to take some of these questions, obviously, in the next 15 minutes that we have. But should some of these questions not get answered or your question not get answered, please be assured that we will respond to you on the mail subsequently. Thank you very much for your patience and your interest in listening. I'm going to now just turn it over to questions. Vandana, I believe you have a couple of questions already lined up. May I request you to read out the first one, please?
Sure. So one of the questions that we've received from our participant is that can we use a 360-degree feedback form for identifying high potentials? And do we inform our employees who these high potentials are once they've been identified?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vandana, for that question. When we look at high potential, at least when, so all this know-how really comes to us through a lot of research from IBM and our own experience. We define high potentials in two ways. We look at, for example, what is inherently leadership material in that person. So we look at the nature, we look at the personality, we look at the preference of a person to take on a leadership role. And we also look at the behaviors that a person has been able to develop. So potential, when we look at high potentials, what we are looking at is just the past performance, and let's say a past performance has gone very well, does not ensure a future potential for a leader in a leadership role. So what we have to measure is the preference, personality, or the nature of the person. And what we also have to measure is to what extent are these leadership behaviors already learned. So this is the typical question that people ask: are leaders made and born? So of course 30% of it is inherent. So if a person doesn't have a preference, that's 30% contribution to a leadership role, then that's a major gap. But also, to what extent has the person had experiences to develop these behaviors, which is learned behavior. A 360-degree measures the learned behaviors, but it doesn't give you the preference data. So, and we all know that there is a huge cost to people being promoted in wrong roles. So the cost, especially a leadership cost, is multiple. So you really don't want that you have a high potential identified based on 360-degree, because 360-degree alone is only giving you perception of the people, or perception of the, let's say, all the stakeholders of the person's behavior, and this data in itself may not be fully complete. So we would recommend that it needs to be augmented with data which is from performance, augmented with certain data which is to do with their own preferences to perform leadership role, and then a considered view can be taken.
Another question that we have from our participants is around challenges in creating learning goals. So sometimes there is confusion between a KRA and a learning goal for a role. So how do you overcome this?
Yeah, that's a really relevant question. And, in at least I can talk of our experience in the last definitely 4 or 5 years when we've looked at, the IDPs created by people within organizations, and organizations themselves also really face this challenge because most of the learning goals are actually KRAs. Um, so it's really not very helpful to say that, I need to, for example, I'll take an example. I'm not being able to meet my goals. Let's say I'm not being able to meet my revenue targets. So what I need to do is I need to build influencing. Now, what really does influencing mean, and what do I need to do to be able to learn influencing is not clear at all. And so what people do is continue to focus on the what, which is try to achieve their target, but not focus on the how, which is the learning gap because of which I'm not being able to achieve my target. So let's look at the same example. So supposing we say influence is a gap. What we propose, and when we work with organizations, what we recommend is, a guide that describes what influence looks like for that person's role, and what is a best practice around it, and what is it that superior performers do by way of influencing. So, for example, does influence really mean that I need to have thorough knowledge of my products, thorough knowledge of my markets, and thorough knowledge of my customers? Is that what it means? Or does it mean I need to have the skill to be able to really unearth the need of the client? That means the skill of listening, the skill of probing, which helps me to unearth the underlying need of the client and be able to link my product or my proposal to that particular need. Or does it mean that I should be an expert in the business of the client? What does it really mean? What will help me to really influence? And of course, it could be all of this, or it could, and for a person, it could be any one thing. Now, let's say if I have been identified as a person who has this gap in skill, and if this is really clear to me, I could then identify that my learning gap is I do not have enough information and understanding of my clients, of my customers, of the market, of the trends, of my products. I don't know, for example, that a new product that has been introduced by my company, let's say it's an implement in an agri machinery, will really help the client, beat the drought. conditions. So if I don't have this particular knowledge, I cannot influence my customers effectively. And therefore now I can identify that my learning gap is I should then look at a project which helps me to understand and build thorough knowledge around these areas. And that becomes something that I work on rather than just working on the measure of getting enough revenue targets as per my KRA. And that's the difference between a KRA and a learning goal. And this is a big, big problem for a lot of people. And that's where if we get this equation right, it becomes very easy because then a person understands it and a person will naturally know what to work on.
All right. Thanks a lot, Neeta. Another question that we have from our participant is that many times organizations understand that learning and acquiring new skills and knowledge is very, very important. However, these initiatives or these journeys where IDPs are getting created fail. And or sometimes they're just an HR or an L&D agenda and there's not enough buy-in of stakeholders. So how do you overcome something like this?
Right. So here we are talking about the buy-in of the person who needs to be developed. Am I right? Is that, or at least let's assume that, because there are two parts to this. One is the importance of the buy-in of all the stakeholders. So let's say I'm very interested, I'm doing everything, but my manager is not really supporting it. That's very important because it's important that that alignment happens, and that also is a huge gap in organizations. Sometimes you have high potential people identified who go through journeys, but the managers are not taken on board, and the managers are not given the skills to support that initiative. That can be a huge gap because a person loses interest. So that is one gap of how do you ensure that all stakeholders are aligned to a development process and development of the people who they lead. But the second important thing, and I'm going to address that now, is really how do we ensure the buy-in of the learner or the participant or the person himself or herself. And that again is a huge gap. Now, I'm also going to refer to some recent research when I'm talking about this. So there is a paradox here. If we look at engagement surveys or if we look at exit interviews, a lot of people talk about the fact that they haven't got enough learning opportunities in organizations, and the way it is manifested or the way it is put forward is career pathing. So I don't know where my career is going to go. I have no idea about it. And that is a big demotivator for me. I don't know my career growth plan. So that is how it comes through. But if you dig a little bit deeper, it's got to do with the fact that a person feels he or she is not growing in an organization. And this growing is to do with learning. Now, if we provide this learning for people and we really align the person to it, I think we can solve the problem A of development, but B also of engagement, and of course C of attrition. Now, how this can be done and where the gaps really happen is one of the gaps is we constantly focus on gaps. We constantly focus on areas of development. We don't focus on areas of strength enough. And when we look at motivation of people and when we try to drive them in areas which they are not good at, it only makes them feel more and more as failures. And this obviously does not engage them enough. One of the key skills that managers need to know now is how do we ensure that we pick up, we observe, we pick up, and we feed back the strengths of the people who we lead. Because it is only strengths that you can leverage for higher performance. Development gaps have to be bridged so that they don't become derailers. But that's not where you're going to get excellence. So in short, how do we ensure that we know what these strengths are and we are giving enough feedback on these strengths and the person is also understanding the strengths. An assumption that we often make is that individuals are very aware of their strengths and the individuals are very aware of how they can leverage it. I think this is an assumption. So we really don't know enough of ourselves. We really don't know enough of our potential. We really don't know enough of how much we can really achieve. And leaders who are able to crack this are able to get the highest performance from their people, but more important, the engagement. Because of course, what we really want to do is to enable each person to perform to their potential. And I think that alignment can happen if we focus on the strengths. So that is one. Do we know what these strengths are? Do we feed these back? And do we have the kind of conversations which encourage people to use and leverage their strengths towards organization goals? And also work in more collaborative ways, because nobody is going to be super in every strength. But how we can counter some of the development areas is to build in a culture of collaboration so that in groups, in teams, these are also being managed well. I don't know if I've answered the question, but of course, if there's another part of it, I'll encourage more questions on the chat, and we can come back to that.
Sure. We'll take one last question from the participants. So when L&D has to operate on a cost recovery model, basically, how can you ensure that businesses are willing to pay the price of an initiative which is longer in terms of time and requires cost investment? This is especially challenging in developing countries where need for L&D services is higher, but money available for investing in the same is limited. So any suggestions or any comments that you have on this?
Yeah, I think this is I can see it from an organization perspective totally. We want everything, we need everything. We not only want, we need everything, but we are constrained, and every business today is constrained by the investments that they can make. I would really propose a partnership model here where organizations can use, experts in this area, and I'm not talking about us, but I'm talking about any expert in the area, to build that competency to an extent. So basically, what the point that I'm making is use a partner to build that competency internally. So you don't have to use services of an organization for the entire process, but you can decide it piecemeal. Now that's one. So what you're looking at is you realize that it's a long-term journey, a long-term investment, but you can break it up and you can use expertise where it is absolutely critical and develop the expertise also within through the process. That's one. I think the second thing is the question was also to do with buy-in of the business, because the budgets come from the business. They can't come from L&D. And I think that will happen when we start asking the business guys. And believe me, at least in the organizations that I have seen, very often the HR people or the L&D people are not fully on board with the competencies required for the business to be successful. So we start having conversations with business. When I say business, it's functions, it's also business at an overall level, to say that exactly this question: what competencies are absolutely critical? Where is it that we are lagging? What is it that we should focus on? And then basically say that if this is what we really need to focus on, which are the critical roles? Let's not look at biting the entire piece. Let's look at absolutely critical roles, and let's see how we can enable these critical roles to perform their best. Now, development is a little long-term process, so you have to then quickly show some results. And the results come when the people start talking about it and saying, and actually you see on the ground, they're doing exactly what the business leaders want them to do. And I think if you can make that connection for them, slowly I think you can then say, okay, we've done it for a few roles, for some critical pieces. How is it that we can then cascade this down? And I think really in today's context, we have to look at working in partnerships. Like we're saying, it's getting very complex. There's a real cost to learning. You don't want to spend very long periods of learning. You don't want to make too many mistakes. So learn from mistakes of others by using partners and partnership, but then try to see what is worthwhile for your organization and pick up those pieces. Start with that, show some result in that. Don't make it an L&D agenda or an OD agenda. Make it a business agenda, and then see how you can build on it. So build on what you start small, but then of course have the big picture in mind.
Thanks, Neeta. So those were all the questions from our participants. In case there are any more questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@inspireone.in, and we'll be happy to get back to you over email or a phone call. So thanks a lot.
Thank you all very much for having the patience. I hope this was helpful.